I walked into that auction wearing a suit my grandfather gave me. Nothing flashy, just honest. The fabric was well worn, but impeccably maintained, a testament to the man who'd passed it down to me, along with so much more than just clothing. The weight of it on my shoulders felt different today, heavier somehow, as if it carried the memories of all the times he'd worn it to important meetings, negotiations, and moments that defined his legacy. The woman at the front desk looked me up and down and said, "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?" Her voice carried that particular blend of condescension and confusion that I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Her manicured nails tapped against the marble counter as she waited for my response, her eyes already dismissing me before I'd even spoken. A few people nearby laughed. The sound echoed through the ornate lobby of Pemberton and Associates, Manhattan's most prestigious auction house, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and oil paintings that adorned the walls. I recognized some of the faces, collectors, dealers, and society figures who frequented these events like others might frequent their local coffee shop. To them, I was an anomaly, a disruption in their carefully curated world. I didn't respond. Instead, I simply nodded politely and made my way toward the main auction hall, my footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs that covered the hardwood floors. I could feel their eyes following me, whispers trailing in my wake like smoke from expensive cigarettes. The auction hall was a monument to old money and older taste. Red velvet seats arranged in perfect rows faced a mahogany podium where the auctioneer would soon begin his performance. The walls were lined with preview pieces, paintings, sculptures, and artifacts that would find new homes before the evening was over. The air was thick with the scent of leather-bound catalogues and the subtle perfume of women who could afford to bid on Monet without checking their bank accounts. I sat quietly in the back and waited. From my position, I could observe the room's dynamics, the subtle hierarchies that governed this world. The front rows were reserved for the serious players, men in $1,000 suits and women dripping in jewelry that cost more than most people's homes. The middle section held the hopeful collectors, those with enough money to participate but not enough to dominate. And then there was the back, where curiosity seekers and occasional bidders like myself were relegated. The seat beside me was occupied by an elderly woman named Margaret Thorne, whose family had been collecting art for 3 generations. She glanced at me with mild interest, probably wondering if I was a journalist or perhaps the grandson of someone important. I offered her a polite smile and returned to studying the catalogue. As the auction began, I watched the theatre unfold. The auctioneer, a distinguished man named Henry Pemberton III, commanded the room with the ease of someone born to this world. His voice carried the authority of generations of successful sales, each word carefully measured and delivered with practiced precision. The first few lots went quickly, minor pieces that served as warm-ups for the main event. I watched the bidding patterns, the subtle signals and psychological warfare that characterized these proceedings. A raised eyebrow here, a casual flip of a paddle there, each gesture representing thousands of dollars changing hands. When the first piece came up, a painting I knew intimately because my father once tried to buy it, I felt my pulse quicken. It was a Cézanne still life, apples and oranges, a masterpiece that had hung in a private collection for 40 years. I remembered the day my father had attempted to purchase it, how he'd been dismissed and humiliated by the very establishment that now struggled to understand my presence. The painting was positioned on an easel beside the podium, its colors vibrant under the carefully arranged lighting. I could see the brush strokes from where I sat, the way Cézanne had built up the surface with layers of paint, creating a texture that seemed to breathe with life. My father had taught me to see beyond the surface, to understand not just the aesthetic value, but the historical significance, the cultural impact, the human story behind each piece. The bidding opened at $200,000. Hands went up around the room, predictable players making predictable moves. I watched a man in the third row signal his bid with a slight nod, his wife's diamonds catching the light as she leaned forward in anticipation. Behind them, a woman in a burgundy dress raised her paddle with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The price climbed steadily. 300,000, 350, 400. I could feel the tension building in the room, that electric moment when serious money began to change hands. The casual observers fell silent, understanding that they were witnessing something significant. At 450,000, the bidding slowed. The man in the third row hesitated, his wife whispering urgently in his ear. The woman in burgundy had stopped bidding at 425, her limit apparently reached. Only one bidder remained active, a silver-haired gentleman in the front row who looked like he could buy the entire building without breaking a sweat. I raised my paddle. The auctioneer's eyes found mine across the room. For a moment he seemed confused, as if he wasn't sure he'd seen correctly. "I have a new bidder," he announced, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The room turned to look at me. I could feel their stares, the weight of their curiosity and skepticism. The man in the front row glanced back, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. He was clearly not accustomed to being challenged by someone he didn't recognize. 460,000, Pemberton called out, his voice regaining its professional composure. The silver-haired gentleman raised his paddle immediately. 470. I didn't hesitate. My paddle went up again. 480, the auctioneer announced. The bids climbed. I didn't blink. Each time the other bidder increased his offer, I matched it without hesitation. The room had gone completely silent now, the only sounds the auctioneer's voice and the occasional rustle of a program or the soft click of a phone camera. At 480,000, my opponent paused. I could see him calculating, weighing his desire for the painting against his practical limits. He was a businessman, I realized, someone who understood value and wasn't about to overpay for the sake of pride. The room went quiet. The auctioneer looked between us, his gavel poised. "Do I hear 490,000? Silence. I said calmly, 500. The words cut through the silence like a blade. The auctioneer paused, his practiced composure momentarily shaken. 500,000. "No," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. 500,001. The room laughed nervously. It was the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort, from witnessing something unexpected and slightly absurd. The bid was unconventional, almost insulting in its precision. In a world where people casually threw around hundreds of thousands of dollars, adding a single dollar seemed like a joke. But I wasn't joking. I stood up and walked to the front as the gavel fell. My footsteps echoed in the suddenly quiet room, each one deliberate and measured. I could feel every eye on me, could sense the questions forming in their minds. Who was this man? Where had he come from? How did he have $500,000 to spend on a painting? "That should cover my welcome," I said, my voice carrying just enough edge to make my point without being overtly confrontational. The same woman from the front desk stared, speechless. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. The confidence she displayed earlier had evaporated, replaced by a confusion that bordered on panic. As I made my way to complete the transaction, I could hear the whispers starting. The room buzzed with speculation and gossip, the kind of energy that would fuel conversations at dinner parties for weeks to come. I had disrupted their carefully ordered world, and they didn't know how to process it. The payment process was handled with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of practice. The auction house's financial team verified my credentials with the quiet professionalism of people who'd seen every conceivable scenario. Within minutes, I was the proud owner of a painting that had been beyond my father's reach 30 years ago. Later, as I stood examining my purchase, one man approached and said, "We underestimated you." He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested private schools and Ivy League education. His name was Jonathan Blackwood, and he represented one of the city's most influential art advisory firms. I smiled. "You always do." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of years of experience. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed by people who judged worth by appearances rather than substance. It was the story of my life, and tonight had been just another chapter in that ongoing narrative. But as I left the auction house that evening, my new acquisition carefully wrapped and secured, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been straightforward, but it had been mine, and that made all the difference. The story began, as many stories do, with a death. My grandfather, William Morrison, had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving behind a modest estate and a lifetime of secrets. I'd known him as a quiet man who worked as a night watchman at a downtown office building, someone who lived simply and spoke rarely about his past. He'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, providing stability and love, but never luxury. It was only after his funeral that I discovered the truth about who William Morrison really was. While cleaning out his small apartment, I found a hidden safe behind a false wall in his bedroom closet. Inside were documents that revealed a life I'd never suspected, stock certificates, bank accounts, and most shocking of all, a letter explaining everything. My grandfather had been a successful businessman in his youth, the owner of a small but profitable manufacturing company. He'd sold it in 1987 for a considerable sum, then spent the next 30 years living as if he were poor, while his investments grew quietly in the background. The letter explained his reasoning. He'd wanted to raise me without the burden of wealth to ensure I learned the value of hard work and honest living. The inheritance was substantial, not enough to buy Manhattan, but more than enough to change my life if I chose to let it. The letter also contained instructions for how I should reveal myself to the world that had never known my family's true circumstances. "They will judge you," he'd written, "but let them. Your worth was never determined by their opinions." So I'd spent the months following his death, learning about this new world I'd inherited. I studied art and antiquities, not just as investments but as windows into human creativity and expression. I learned about auction houses and private sales, about the intricate social networks that governed the art world. And slowly, I began to understand why my grandfather had chosen to live as he had. The auction tonight hadn't been about the painting, though I genuinely loved Cézanne's work. It had been about making a statement, about stepping out of the shadows and claiming my place in a world that had always existed parallel to my own. It had been about honoring my grandfather's memory and my father's unfulfilled dreams. As I walked home through the streets of Manhattan, the city lights reflecting off the windows of shops and restaurants, I thought about the woman at the front desk and her question, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The truth was, I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. This was exactly where I belonged, not because of the money I'd inherited, but because of the values and character my grandfather had instilled in me. The painting would hang in my apartment, a reminder of this evening and everything it represented. But more than that, it would serve as a bridge between my past and my future, between the man I'd been and the man I was becoming. It would remind me that worth isn't about what others see on the surface, but about what lies beneath, the depth of character, the strength of conviction, the courage to stand up and be counted when it matters most. In the weeks that followed, I received several invitations to gallery openings and private viewings. Word had spread about the mysterious bidder who'd appeared from nowhere and made such an impression at Pemberton and Associates. Some of the invitations were genuine, sent by people who were curious about my story and interested in building real connections. Others were clearly from social climbers who sensed opportunity and wanted to position themselves accordingly. I accepted some, and declined others, learning to navigate this new world with the same careful consideration my grandfather had taught me to apply to everything in life. I discovered that the art world, like any other, was populated by all kinds of people, genuine enthusiasts and shameless opportunists, brilliant scholars and pretentious frauds, generous patrons and ruthless competitors. One of the most interesting people I met was Elena Vasquez, a young curator at the Museum of Modern Art who specialized in early 20th century European painting. We met at a gallery opening in Soho, where she was standing alone in front of a series of abstract expressionist works, completely absorbed in her study of the pieces. "They're beautiful," I said, joining her in front of a particularly striking canvas. "They're angry," she replied without looking at me. "That's what makes them beautiful." It was the beginning of a friendship that would prove to be one of the most meaningful aspects of my new life. Elena had grown up in a working-class family in Queens, the daughter of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they'd never had. She'd earned her position at the museum through pure talent and determination, overcoming obstacles that would have defeated someone with less resilience. We shared a similar perspective on art and life, an appreciation for beauty combined with an understanding of the struggle required to create and preserve it. She became my guide to the intellectual side of the art world, helping me understand not just what to buy, but why it mattered, how it fit into the broader context of human expression and cultural evolution. Through Elena, I met other people who shared our values, artists, scholars, and collectors who were motivated by genuine passion rather than social climbing or investment potential. We formed a small but tight-knit community, united by our love of art and our commitment to supporting emerging artists who might not otherwise have access to the resources they needed to develop their talents. It was through this network that I learned about Marcus Chen, a young painter from San Francisco who was struggling to make ends meet while pursuing his artistic vision. His work was extraordinary, complex, layered compositions that seemed to capture something essential about the modern urban experience. But he was unknown, working a day job at a coffee shop and painting in his tiny studio apartment at night. Elena showed me photographs of his work, and I knew immediately that I wanted to meet him. We arranged a studio visit, and I spent an afternoon in his cramped space, surrounded by canvases that took my breath away. His paintings were raw and emotional, filled with the kind of honesty that can only come from someone who's lived through real struggle and emerged with something meaningful to say. I bought 3 of his pieces that day, paying him more than he'd made in the previous 6 months. But more importantly, I introduced him to Elena and the network of people who could help him develop his career. Within a year, he was showing in established galleries and building a reputation that would eventually lead to international recognition. This became my pattern, using my resources not just to acquire art for myself, but to support artists and institutions that were doing important work. I established a small foundation that provided grants to emerging artists, funded scholarships for students from underserved communities, and supported museums and cultural organizations that were committed to making art accessible to broader audiences. The work was deeply satisfying, but it also came with challenges. I discovered that the art world, like any other, had its share of people who were more interested in my money than in my mission. I learned to be selective about my partnerships and careful about my investments, applying the same principles of integrity and authenticity that my grandfather had taught me. One of the most difficult situations I encountered involved a highly regarded gallery owner named Richard Pemberton, nephew of the auctioneer who'd presided over my first major purchase. Richard had approached me about investing in a new space he was planning to open, promising to focus on socially conscious art and emerging artists from diverse backgrounds. I was initially interested, but as I did my due diligence, I discovered that Richard's track record didn't match his promises. His previous galleries had focused primarily on established artists whose work would sell to wealthy collectors, and his commitment to diversity seemed to be more about marketing than genuine belief. When I declined his proposal, he became hostile, suggesting that I didn't understand the real art world and that my money couldn't buy me credibility. It was a painful reminder that my grandfather's warnings about judgment and prejudice were still relevant. But it also reinforced my commitment to staying true to my values, even when it meant making difficult decisions or facing criticism from people whose opinions I might once have valued. The most rewarding aspect of my new life was the relationships I was able to build with artists and other people who shared my passion for creativity and authentic expression. I spent countless hours in studios and galleries, learning about different techniques and approaches, understanding the historical and cultural contexts that shaped artistic movements. I also began to travel more extensively, visiting museums and cultural sites around the world. These trips weren't just about seeing famous artworks, though I certainly did that, but about understanding how different cultures approached creativity and expression. I spent time in small villages in Italy, where traditional craftsmen still practiced techniques that had been passed down for generations. I visited contemporary art centers in Tokyo and Berlin, where young artists were pushing boundaries and exploring new possibilities. Each experience added to my understanding of art's role in human life, not just as decoration or investment, but as a fundamental form of communication and connection. I began to see my collection not as a personal treasure trove, but as a temporary stewardship of objects that would outlive me and continue to inspire and challenge future generations. This perspective was reinforced during a visit to the Louvre, where I spent an entire afternoon sitting in front of a single painting, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. As I watched other visitors pass by, some pausing briefly while others barely glancing, I realized that the true value of art lies not in its price tag, but in its ability to stop us in our tracks, to make us see the world differently, to connect us across time and space with the experiences and emotions of people we'll never meet. It was during this same trip to Paris that I encountered a situation that would test everything I'd learned about judgment and authenticity. I was visiting a small gallery in the Marais district when I overheard a conversation between two American tourists and the gallery owner. The tourists were clearly wealthy, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying designer bags, but they were speaking dismissively about the artwork, reducing everything to investment potential and social status. "This would look good in the Hampton House," one of them said, about a beautiful abstract painting. "How much do you think it will appreciate?" The gallery owner, a passionate young woman named Sophie, was trying to explain the artistic and historical significance of the piece, but the tourists weren't interested in anything beyond its potential return on investment. I watched as Sophie's enthusiasm dimmed, her shoulders sagging with disappointment. After the tourists left, I approached Sophie and spent the next hour talking with her about the artwork and her vision for the gallery. She was trying to support local artists and create a space where art could be experienced and appreciated rather than simply consumed. But she was struggling financially, competing with larger galleries that catered to tourists and collectors who were more interested in names than in genuine artistic merit. I ended up buying several pieces from her gallery, but more importantly, I connected her with Elena and other people in my network who could help her develop sustainable relationships with serious collectors and institutions. Within a few months, her gallery was thriving, and she was able to expand her program to include educational workshops and community outreach initiatives. These experiences taught me that my role in the art world wasn't just about acquiring objects or supporting individual artists. It was about fostering a culture that valued authenticity, creativity, and genuine human connection. It was about creating spaces where art could fulfill its highest purpose, helping us understand ourselves and each other more deeply. As I reflect on the journey that began with that auction at Pemberton and Associates, I realize that my grandfather's greatest gift wasn't the money he left me. It was the wisdom to understand that true worth comes from within. The suit he gave me wasn't just clothing. It was a reminder that dignity and character are more valuable than any external trappings of success. The woman at the front desk who questioned my presence represented a mindset that judges value by appearance, that assumes worth can be measured by superficial markers. But her question, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" has become a guiding principle for me. I'm exactly where I belong, not because of what I own or how much I can spend, but because of who I am and what I stand for. The art world, like any other, is filled with people who are quick to judge and slow to understand. But it's also filled with individuals of extraordinary talent, passion, and vision, people who create beauty and meaning in a world that often seems to value neither. My privilege is to be able to support these individuals and to help ensure that their contributions are recognized and preserved for future generations. Every piece in my collection tells a story, not just about the artist who created it, but about the moment when I encountered it and the journey that brought me to that point. The Cézanne from that first auction hangs in my living room, and every time I look at it, I remember the feeling of standing up in that room full of strangers and claiming my place in their world. But I also remember the more subtle moments, the quiet conversations with artists in their studios, the shared excitement of discovering something new and beautiful, the satisfaction of knowing that my support helped someone pursue their passion and develop their talent. These are the moments that give meaning to wealth and purpose to privilege. As I write this, I'm preparing for another auction, this time at Christie's, where a remarkable collection of contemporary African art is being offered. I've spent weeks studying the catalogue, learning about the artists and the cultural context that shaped their work. I know that when I walk into that auction room, I'll once again be judged by my appearance, my age, my apparent place in the social hierarchy. But I also know that I'll be ready. I'll be wearing my grandfather's suit, carrying his values, and representing not just my own interests, but the interests of artists and art lovers everywhere who believe that creativity and authenticity are more important than status and social climbing. The question isn't whether I belong in these spaces, it's whether these spaces are worthy of what I bring to them. And if they're not, then it's my responsibility to help change them, one auction, one gallery opening, one conversation at a time. This is the story of how I learned to claim my place in the world, not through aggression or arrogance, but through quiet confidence and unwavering commitment to my values. It's the story of discovering that true worth isn't about what others see on the surface, but about what lies beneath. The depth of character, the strength of conviction, the courage to stand up and be counted when it matters most. And it's the story of understanding that our greatest achievements aren't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute to our communities, to our culture, and to the ongoing human project of creating meaning and beauty in a complex and often challenging world. In the end, that's the most valuable inheritance anyone can receive and the most meaningful legacy anyone can leave behind. The months following that first auction transformed not just my relationship with the art world, but my understanding of human potential itself. I began to see patterns everywhere, people whose true capabilities were hidden beneath surface judgments, individuals whose brilliance was overlooked because they didn't fit conventional expectations. It was as if my grandfather's lesson about worth had opened my eyes to a reality that had always existed, but which I'd never fully recognized. One of the most profound examples of this hidden potential came through my relationship with David Chen, the younger brother of Marcus, the painter I'd supported. David worked as a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, spending his nights walking through darkened galleries, surrounded by some of the world's greatest masterpieces. Most people saw him as just another uniformed employee, invisible and insignificant in the grand scheme of the institution. But when I met David during a private viewing that Marcus had arranged, I discovered something extraordinary. This quiet man, who checked bags and monitored galleries, had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of art history that rivaled that of many curators. During our conversation, he casually mentioned details about brushwork techniques, historical provenance, and artistic influences that revealed a depth of understanding that took my breath away. "I've been surrounded by these works for 8 years," he explained, when I expressed amazement at his knowledge. "You can't help but learn when you're alone with them every night. I talk to them, study them, try to understand what the artists were thinking when they created them." David had never attended art school, had no formal training in art history or criticism, but his nightly communion with masterpieces had given him an education that money couldn't buy. He could identify the hand of different artists within the same school, could discuss the evolution of techniques across centuries, could contextualize works within their historical and cultural frameworks with the precision of a scholar. The tragedy was that his insights were completely unknown to the museum's academic staff. He was just the security guard, someone whose job was to watch and protect, not to think or contribute. The institutional hierarchy made it impossible for his voice to be heard, his knowledge to be recognized, his potential to be realized. I decided to change that. Working with Elena, I arranged for David to meet with several prominent art historians and curators. The meetings were informal at first, coffee conversations where David could share his observations and insights without the pressure of formal academic credentials. The response was unanimous. This man possessed a rare combination of intuitive understanding and scholarly rigor that marked him as a natural art historian. Within 6 months, David was enrolled in a master's program in art history at Columbia University, his tuition covered by a scholarship from my foundation. His thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Williams, told me later that she'd never encountered a student who brought such depth of personal connection to academic study. David's years of solitary observation had given him insights that traditional classroom learning could never provide. The transformation was remarkable to witness. David's confidence grew as he learned to articulate his knowledge in academic language, as he discovered that his intuitive understanding could be validated and expanded through formal study. But more importantly, he began to see himself differently, not as someone who was lucky to have a job watching art, but as someone who had earned his place in the conversation about art's meaning and significance. David's story became a model for how I approached other situations where I encountered hidden potential. There was Maria Santos, a restaurant server who had immigrated from Guatemala and worked double shifts to support her family. During a chance conversation at a gallery opening she was catering, I discovered that she had been a respected painter in her home country, but had abandoned her art when she moved to New York because she couldn't afford supplies and had no time to create. I arranged for Maria to have access to a studio space and materials, and within months she was creating works that captured the immigrant experience with a power and authenticity that moved everyone who saw them. Her paintings bridged her Guatemalan heritage with her American present, creating a visual dialogue about identity, belonging, and the complex emotions of starting over in a new country. There was James Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, a homeless veteran who spent his days in Washington Square Park, sketching portraits of tourists and street performers. Most people saw him as just another casualty of the system, someone to be pitied or avoided. But I saw the extraordinary skill in his quick pencil sketches, the way he could capture not just physical likeness, but emotional essence in a few swift strokes. James had studied art before his military service, but trauma and addiction had derailed his career. Through a combination of support, treatment, and opportunity, he was able to get clean and begin creating again. His drawings of street life in New York became a powerful documentary of urban experience, exhibited in galleries and collected by major museums. Each of these stories reinforced my growing understanding that talent and potential exist everywhere, but opportunity and recognition are distributed much more unevenly. The art world, like every other field, has its gatekeepers and hierarchies, its assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. But some of the most powerful and authentic voices come from outside these established systems, from people who have been overlooked or dismissed because they don't fit conventional expectations. This realization led me to expand my foundation's mission beyond supporting individual artists to challenging the systems that kept talented people marginalized. I began funding programs that brought art education to underserved communities, that provided pathways for people from non-traditional backgrounds to enter the art world, that created opportunities for voices that had been historically excluded from cultural conversations. One of our most successful initiatives was a partnership with the city's public library system to create art studios in low-income neighborhoods. These weren't just spaces for hobby classes or children's activities. They were serious creative facilities where emerging artists could develop their work, receive mentorship from established professionals, and connect with the broader art community. The impact was immediate and profound. We discovered photographers who had been documenting their communities with disposable cameras, sculptors who had been working with found materials in their apartments, painters who had been creating masterpieces on cardboard because they couldn't afford canvas. These artists didn't need charity, they needed opportunity, recognition, and the resources to develop their already considerable talents. The program also revealed something important about the nature of creativity itself. When people are given the tools and support to express themselves authentically, the results are often more powerful and meaningful than work produced within traditional academic or commercial frameworks. The urgency of lived experience, the authenticity of personal struggle, the clarity of vision that comes from being outside mainstream culture, these elements combined to create art that was both beautiful and transformative. This understanding began to influence my own collecting practices. While I still appreciated and acquired works by established masters, I became increasingly drawn to pieces that told stories of resilience, discovery, and unexpected potential. My collection became a kind of museum of human possibility, each piece representing not just artistic achievement, but the triumph of individual vision over circumstance. The centerpiece of this collection was a series of paintings by an artist named Thomas Wright, whose story embodied everything I'd learned about hidden potential and second chances. Thomas had been a promising art student in the 1980s, but addiction and personal trauma had derailed his career. He'd spent 20 years living on the streets, his talent dormant, his potential seemingly lost. It was Elena who first encountered Thomas's work, sketches he'd drawn on pieces of cardboard and scraps of paper during his years of homelessness. She recognized immediately that these weren't the casual doodles of someone passing time. They were sophisticated studies that revealed an artist of exceptional skill and vision. The drawings captured the hidden life of the city, the dignity of people who had been cast aside, the beauty that existed in the margins of society. Elena brought Thomas to my attention, and I arranged for him to have access to proper materials and studio space. The paintings that emerged were extraordinary, large-scale works that combined technical mastery with emotional depth, that spoke to universal themes of loss, redemption, and the persistence of hope. The art world took notice, and Thomas's first gallery show sold out within hours of opening. But more important than the commercial success was the personal transformation I witnessed in Thomas himself. As he reclaimed his identity as an artist, As he saw his work valued and celebrated, he began to rebuild his life in other ways. He entered recovery, reconnected with family members he'd lost touch with, and eventually became a mentor to other artists who were struggling with similar challenges. Thomas's story became a powerful example of how artistic expression can be both a result of healing and a catalyst for it. His paintings didn't just document his experiences, they helped him process and transcend them. And for viewers, his work served as a reminder that genius can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that talent doesn't recognize social boundaries, and that second chances can lead to extraordinary outcomes. The success of artists like Thomas, Maria, James, and David began to change how I was perceived in the art world. No longer was I just the mysterious bidder who'd appeared from nowhere. I was becoming known as someone who had an eye for undiscovered talent, who could recognize potential before it was obvious to others. Gallery owners began seeking my opinion on new artists, collectors started following my acquisitions, and institutions began partnering with my foundation on programs that supported emerging creators. This recognition brought new opportunities, but also new challenges. I found myself navigating the complex politics of the art world, dealing with people who were more interested in my connections than in my mission, managing the expectations of artists who saw me as a solution to all their problems. It was a delicate balance between using my influence responsibly and maintaining the authentic relationships that had made my work meaningful. One of the most difficult situations arose when I was approached by a group of established artists who complained that my focus on outsider artists was undermining the traditional systems that had nurtured their careers. They argued that art schools, galleries, and established institutions existed for good reasons, that quality control and professional standards were necessary to maintain the integrity of the field. The conversation forced me to examine my own assumptions and biases. Were my efforts to support non-traditional artists somehow unfair to those who had followed conventional paths? Was I romanticizing struggle and marginalization in ways that were ultimately counterproductive? These were legitimate questions that deserved serious consideration. After much reflection, I concluded that my mission wasn't to replace traditional systems, but to expand them, to create more pathways for talent to be recognized and developed. The art world was big enough for both approaches, for artists who emerged from prestigious schools and those who learned on the streets, for work that reflected academic traditions and pieces that challenged established conventions. What mattered wasn't the path someone had taken to become an artist, but the authenticity and power of what they created. The goal wasn't to lower standards, but to recognize that excellence comes in many forms, that innovation often emerges from unexpected places, and that diversity of background and experience strengthens rather than weakens the entire field. This philosophy was put to the test when I was invited to curate an exhibition at a major museum, my first opportunity to present my vision of art's potential to a broad public audience. The exhibition, titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Discovering America's Unknown Masters, featured works by artists who had been overlooked by the mainstream art world, but whose talent was undeniable. The preparation process was intense and revealing. Working with a team of curators, conservators, and educators, I had to articulate not just which artists to include, but why their work mattered, how it fit into broader conversations about American art and culture, and what visitors could learn from encountering these previously unknown voices. The exhibition included Thomas's paintings of street life, Maria's explorations of immigrant identity, James's drawings of urban struggle, and David's scholarly analysis of historical techniques applied to contemporary themes. But it also featured works by dozens of other artists whose stories embodied the central theme, that talent and vision exist throughout society, waiting to be recognized and celebrated. The public response was overwhelming. The exhibition drew record crowds, generated extensive media coverage, and sparked conversations about how cultural institutions could better serve diverse communities. But more importantly, it demonstrated that audiences were hungry for authentic voices, for art that reflected the full spectrum of human experience rather than just the perspectives of a privileged few. The success of the exhibition led to touring versions that traveled to museums across the country, reaching audiences who might never have encountered these artists otherwise. It also inspired other institutions to examine their own collections and programming, to consider how they might better represent the diversity of American creativity. For me, the exhibition represented the culmination of everything I'd learned since that first auction. It demonstrated that my grandfather's lesson about hidden worth wasn't just personal wisdom. It was a principle that could transform entire institutions and communities. When we learn to see beyond surface appearances, when we recognize that value isn't determined by conventional markers of success, we open ourselves to discoveries that can change everything. The artists featured in the exhibition went on to have successful careers, their work acquired by major collectors and institutions. But their individual success was less important than the broader impact of their recognition. They became examples of what was possible when talent was given the opportunity to flourish, when barriers were removed and potential was allowed to emerge. As I reflect on this journey, I'm struck by how much I've learned from the artists I've supported. Each one has taught me something about resilience, about the power of authentic expression, about the importance of staying true to one's vision, even when the world seems indifferent or hostile. They've shown me that creativity isn't a luxury but a necessity, that art isn't decoration but communication, that culture isn't entertainment but the ongoing conversation through which we make sense of our shared humanity. The Cézanne painting that started this journey still hangs in my living room, but it's no longer the centerpiece of my collection. That honor now belongs to a collaborative piece created by all the artists my foundation has supported. A massive installation that combines painting, sculpture, photography, and mixed media into a celebration of diverse voices and hidden potential. The installation is called "We Were Always Here," and it tells the story of talent that existed in the shadows, waiting to be seen. Each artist contributed elements that reflected their individual journey while connecting to the broader theme of discovery and recognition. The result is a work that couldn't have been created by any single artist, that required the collaboration of voices from different backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. When visitors encounter the installation, they often ask about the artists who created it, wanting to know their stories and understand their journeys. This curiosity has led to additional opportunities for these artists, but more importantly, it has helped people recognize the potential that exists in their own communities, in the people they encounter every day who might be carrying hidden talents and dreams. The installation serves as a reminder that the woman at the auction house who questioned my presence wasn't unique. We all make assumptions about people based on appearances. We all overlook potential because it doesn't fit our expectations. But when we learn to see differently, when we recognize that worth isn't determined by surface markers, we open ourselves to discoveries that can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. This understanding has become central to how I approach all aspects of my life. Whether I'm considering an investment, evaluating a potential partnership, or simply meeting someone new, I try to look beyond the obvious, to recognize that everyone has a story worth hearing, potential worth nurturing, and contributions worth celebrating. The auction house where this journey began has become a regular part of my life, but my relationship with it has evolved dramatically. I'm no longer the mysterious outsider who surprises people with unexpected bids. I'm a recognized member of the community, someone whose opinion is sought and whose presence is welcomed. But more importantly, I've used my position to help change the culture of these institutions, to make them more inclusive and accessible to diverse voices. The woman at the front desk, who once questioned my presence, now greets me warmly, but our relationship has deepened beyond mere professional courtesy. Through our conversations, I've learned about her own artistic interests and supported her efforts to develop her talents as a photographer. Her images of the auction house and its visitors have become part of my collection, documenting the intersection of art, commerce, and human ambition that defines this world. This personal connection illustrates something important about the nature of transformation. Change doesn't happen through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It happens through individual relationships, through the accumulation of small moments of recognition and respect, through the gradual expansion of our understanding of what's possible and who belongs. As I prepare for future auctions, I carry with me not just my grandfather's suit and his wisdom about worth, but also the stories of all the artists I've encountered along the way. Their journeys remind me that potential exists everywhere, that talent doesn't recognize social boundaries, and that our greatest achievements come not from what we accumulate, but from what we help others discover about themselves. The question the woman asked me that first night, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" has become a guiding principle not just for my presence in the art world, but for my approach to life itself. I'm sure I'm in the right place, not because of what I own or where I come from, but because of what I stand for and what I'm trying to accomplish. And in helping others find their own right place, in recognizing and nurturing the potential that exists within each person I encounter, I've discovered that the most valuable auction isn't the one where we bid on objects created by others, but the one where we invest in the dreams and possibilities of the people around us. That's an auction where everyone can win, where the highest bidder isn't the one with the most money, but the one with the greatest vision of what's possible when human potential is truly seen and supported.